So welcome, welcome, welcome to Mask Off, Responding to Domestic Abuse During COVID-19. I am Melvina Queen, President of the UVA Club of Tidewater, and I just want to welcome everybody today for joining us during your lunchtime. We have some great panelists today, and I want to first just thank Katie Parker and Priyanka Montagna for kind of getting this group of panelists together. They formed a subcommittee from our board, and I just want to thank them because today would not be possible without the two of you, so thank you so much. I also want to highlight a few of our upcoming events for you guys to mark on your calendars. So the first event is actually for our early decision students. We are going to be participating in the virtual regional Southeastern Admitted Students Party on Tuesday, April 13th at 6 p.m. So for those of you that have students that have applied to the university and have received your notices, this is a great opportunity for them to connect with other students that have got their acceptance, and then they can ask our panelists questions about the university before making their final decisions. Our second event is going to be a virtual lunchtime discussion on the Virginia Beach Vibe Creative District, and we will be talking with its executive director, Katie Pittman, and architect Jeremy Maloney on Tuesday, April 20th at noon. And our third event that I'd like to highlight, with the loosened restrictions for COVID-19, we will be doing an in-person, socially distanced horseback riding event on Saturday, May 18th at Triple R Ranch in Chesapeake, Virginia. Now that event is going to be limited spots. We will have 3 different trail rides starting at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., and 12 p.m. So if you are interested in any of these events, stay connected with our club. You can follow us on Facebook at the UVA Club of Tidewater, or you can also follow us at the university's club events at the Greater Network under the UVA Club of Tidewater. It is, Lori's saying May 18th or May 8th. It is May 8th for the horseback trail riding. So again, I want to just thank Katie and Priyanka for putting this on today. It's going to be a very sensitive yet worthwhile topic that I think we should discuss. So without further ado, I want to hand this over to Priyanka Montagna, our Vice President for the UVA Club of Tidewater.
Thank you, Melvina. Welcome again, everyone. My name is Priyanka Montagna. I'm a 2008 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences and current Vice President of the UVA Club of Tidewater. Thank you for joining us today for this important lunch hour panel discussion on domestic abuse during COVID to kick off April as National Child Abuse Prevention Month. We're honored to have 3 guests with us today. Debbie Dail, Senior Advocate Manager and Training Coordinator with Virginia Beach CASA, which is Court Appointed Special Advocates. Next, we have Jenni Tynes. She's a 2011 graduate and a family law attorney at Malinowski Hubbard in Northern Virginia, specifically Fairfax. And last but not least, we have Neisha Hines, founder and CEO of GROW, which stands for Girls Recognizing Our Worth. It's a nonprofit here based out of Hampton Roads, GROW Foundation. So first, we'll hear from Debbie Dail.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. Thank you so much for welcoming me to this panel. I want to provide a little bit of information, and actually my title with CASA has now changed to Program Manager. So if you see that at the bottom, that's who we are. Hey, Morgan, how are you? So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today about domestic violence and the pandemic. I want to tell you a little bit about CASA for those of you who have not heard about us before, and you can move to the next slide if you would, please. Thank you. So CASA is part of a national organization of about 1,000 programs that serve their localities. And what we do is we train community volunteers who have no particular background or degree in how to advocate for abused and neglected children who are before the court system in their locality. So for Virginia Beach CASA, we serve the Virginia Beach Juvenile Domestic Relations Court. CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate, and that is indeed what our volunteers are. Each of our volunteers is appointed to a family group, so a sibling group of children. That may be 1 or that may be 10, and we've had cases that large. And what we do is we see ourselves as the eyes and the ears for the judge, because the judge cannot go out into the community and talk to everyone involved in that child's life to ascertain what's going to be best for them, even though they're the ones making those decisions, right? We also work very closely with the guardian ad litem. That's the child's attorney who's looking out for their best interest. But typically a guardian ad litem has upwards of 30, 40, sometimes 75 children on their case list. A CASA only has the one family group, okay? What we do is we meet with the children weekly in their home environment. Right now during pandemic time, you can guess that's virtual, but we usually go into their homes and meet them weekly, and that may be a foster home or the home that they share with their parents, or maybe they live with grandparents. And that's where we go to meet with them. And we play games and we hang out and we talk. We also talk with their parents, of course, and their guardians. And then one of the most important parts that we do is we talk to all the service providers who are helping that family. So these children have been abused, have been identified as abused and neglected. And so the court has ordered specific services for that family. So it may be counseling for the children and or parents. It may be getting a psychological evaluation. For the children, we want to talk to their teachers, their doctors, those counselors that I mentioned before. Any service providers that are helping that family, that's who we want to talk to, in addition to meeting with the family themselves. And we gather all of that information together and submit a report to the judge for every hearing involving that sibling group moving forward. So we may be on a case for 2 months, we may be on a case for 2 years, and we provide that written report that outlines what we feel is in the child's best interest. And so usually we make recommendations surrounding where should this child live? Should it be in their family home or in foster care or someplace else? We also make a recommendation about if they're not living with their parents, what should visitation look like for the parents? Should it be supervised, no contact, unsupervised? What should that look like? And then finally, we make recommendations about services for both the parents and the children. So it may be, again, things like counseling or evaluations, things like a batterer's intervention program for those families that are experiencing domestic violence. In addition to those codified duties, we are part of the Code of Virginia. We are mandated reporters, so that means anytime we suspect additional abuse or neglect in the course of our work, we must report that immediately to Child Protective Services. Thankfully, we do not have to investigate the allegation. We just tell them what we know or what we saw or what we were told, and they investigate it from there, sometimes involving the police as well. For us, the focus is on safety and permanency for our children. So we always talk about what's in the best interest of the child in relation to those two things. We want to make sure the child is safe. We want to make sure they're not hopping from home to home, but that they have a permanent, stable home for themselves. Okay, next slide. So what have we seen from Virginia Beach CASA's perspective as far as the pandemic's effects on our kiddos that we serve? We have seen, obviously, the things that the general public has seen, right? So less interaction with their peers, seen a lot of food insecurity issues where our children and their families are needing to utilize food pantries when they haven't before. Childcare concerns for our kiddos is big, particularly as parents are struggling to maneuver the going into work versus working from home. And then we had a large portion of our children that are in school, and we're seeing a lot of disparity there. So our children have been in and out in Virginia Beach with virtual and in-person school. And we're seeing a lot of gaps in relation to that for our children, a lot surrounding technology. So many of our families don't have reliable internet or computers. They may have phones, but not computers. And so we're really seeing a gap for our kiddos as far as their ability to learn and their ability to stay connected with their class and with their teachers. So that's a huge difficulty for the kiddos on our cases. They're also seeing services that have been ordered being delayed, or they're being virtual, or they're less frequent. And that's all because their service providers are dealing with the same things you and I are dealing with, which is, how do I continue providing what I'm supposed to be doing at work from home when my dog is on my lap, as she is right now? And how do I keep those appointments regular when I have more and more kids that I need to see and need to provide services for? So they're also having less contact with their mandated reporters. So that includes CASA, right? If we're not in their home, we're not seeing them as closely as we would like to. And if they're not in school, they're only seeing their teachers through the webcam as well. So it makes it really tricky. Next slide, please. As far as the effects on the parents of the children that we're serving, I mean, all of these things that you see here are leading to increased domestic violence. I think across our community and across the state, we are seeing large numbers of domestic violence reports coming in. We're seeing a lot of kids who are caught up in that. and are physically abused. We also see a lot of neglect going on, and that's not new to the pandemic. But you can see the list here. So parents have a lot of economic stressors, particularly related to their jobs, housing insecurity. Virginia Beach has a really high cost of living, so that's another piece here. Particularly for our area, we have a large military population, and so they don't have a large support network to deal with. They're often young and their families are in another state, and that increases the stress, right? So we're thinking of this powder keg growing and growing of all these stressors that are on our parents and the families involved. You add the health concerns into that and the delayed services, just like we have for their kiddos. And it's really just a perfect storm of a situation that can cause domestic violence or lead to that. For our cases, we're especially seeing increased issues with mental health, especially with depression and anxiety, as folks are dealing with the long-standing pandemic and not seeing the end result and an end of that. We're also seeing people self-medicating through substance use. So we're seeing increases in that, and parents overdosing and dying, unfortunately. We're seeing a lot of that. Thank you. Next slide. What we're seeing in JDR Court is, as you can imagine, so our court wasn't closed for 3 months, but it was in a very emergency only sort of hearing situation where they were only hearing like emergency protective orders between adults in domestic violence situations. So as you can imagine, cases got backlogged and they are still catching up on that. I heard the other day in a meeting that if you file a custody petition today in Virginia Beach, you're going to get on the docket in about 5 or 6 months. So that tells you the kind of backlog that we've got going on. In addition, they're trying to limit the number of people in the courthouse because of social distancing protocols and all that good stuff. And so it's really limiting the number of hearings that can be held and limiting the number of people who can be there, which means that the court can't deal with these cases in a timely fashion. The plus of all of this is that they have secured a virtual ability to attend hearings in Virginia Beach, and I hope that that's spreading across the Commonwealth. And that means that parties and their attorneys can attend via WebEx. And so that's been a plus, and having people be able to come in that way, particularly if they've had COVID exposure or they have health issues that make it questionable for them to be able to join those. But for our cases, the ones where we deal with abused and neglected children, especially those in foster care, they have specific timelines the court has to meet. They can't go outside of those timelines, or funding goes away. And we have federal mandates for these timelines. So often when we are having these hearings, they have to be kind of rushed. We might not have the full hearing that we would want to have because we need to deal with that backlog, and we need to make sure we're staying on time with those timelines as well. In addition, for our parents who are incarcerated, they're having to attend via an iPad from their cell. So not exactly private, not exactly gives them the ability to sit next to their attorney representation and have a private conversation. So our judges are clearing the courtroom before a hearing is called so that the client and their attorney can talk privately, and then they're calling everyone else in, which takes a lot of time, as you can imagine, but necessary for the parents to have adequate representation. So it's had some challenges, but the court is doing what they can and doing it very well to try to mitigate the circumstances of the pandemic. Okay, next slide. So just to give you an idea of what some of the interventions mean as far as the importance of prevention for abuse or neglect and domestic violence in the children that we serve, I just listed a couple of things that National CASA has said about our efficacy across the nation in our work with abused and neglected children. And primarily that is in relation to permanency and how well they do. So we're not seeing our kiddos come into foster care. Once they've been in foster care and they leave, they don't come back. They tend to have shorter stays in foster care when they have a CASA appointed to their case. They get more services. Their cases tend to be shorter when they have this advocate's eye on them. And they also do better in school. So our kiddos tend to have better grades, tend to have less behavioral issues in school, and tend to have less expulsions because of those behaviors. So that's just one piece of the many spokes in the wheel that provide interventions for families that are dealing with domestic violence and child abuse. But great statistics from our national program. Next slide, please. So we just encourage you to get involved. And of course, I'm going to do a plug for Virginia Beach CASA or whatever CASA program you have in your locality. Please, if you're interested in advocating for abused and neglected children in the court system, you don't need to have a certain background. We train you fully and it's all free. So we encourage you to look into that. There's also plenty of domestic violence shelters. Schools need our help, lots of health clinics and food drives and all that sort of thing. I just also encourage you to look out for your neighbors and family and friends, particularly when we are all feeling so isolated right now, to really keep an eye out for each other and help where you can and where you feel led. You see there on the screen that today is National Wear Blue Day, so that's why I'm wearing a blue jacket. So if you see folks wearing blue, that's to raise awareness about child abuse prevention for the month of April. And so if you'll go to the next slide, you'll see, I just want to say one more thing and then I'm going to turn it over. We have a Pinwheels for Prevention campaign going on right now. So if you're in Virginia Beach and you see the blue and silver pinwheels across the city, that's our campaign to raise awareness for child abuse and neglect. And on the lawn of the Virginia Beach Courthouse, we will be planting 3,000 of those. And we were hoping to do it today and tomorrow, but with the rain, I think it's just going to be tomorrow. And that represents the first 3,000 children we have served during the course of our 25, 30 years being in existence. So we just invite you to participate. If you want to pick up a pinwheel, our website is there and I can certainly put it in the chat as well. But thank you again for your time and I will pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Jenni, you're next.
All right, thank you, Debbie. So there's certainly some overlap I have with Debbie, and it's clearly a testament to what a pervasive issue this is. I hopefully can shed a little bit more light. The first slide here is a statistic I saw in a recent CNN article. Basically, there's an 8.1% of rise in domestic violence incidents in the US after the lockdowns were initiated. In my mind, I think that's 8% is a floor. And that's what we have from a Department of Sociology, Alex Picaro. I agree with that. I agree with that in my practice. I think, and certainly a floor, I think how much we don't know necessarily is because everyone is isolated and left unchecked, what happens. We don't necessarily have the safeguards as mandatory reporters at school, for example, and I know Debbie touched on that. We have, teachers can only see so much through the screen. And you consider the daily interaction of seeing a coworker, now that interaction has been removed for most people. So, an abused woman who may want to confide in a coworker, now she doesn't have that accessibility. You don't really have someone to, sound off for you. And, most of all, how is a person in a domestic violence situation going to escape the home to go to court and swear an affidavit to hopefully get a protective order or even consult with an attorney by Zoom? A big concern here is, the fear that's engendered in children will be long lasting after the pandemic. It's not necessarily going to go away. And I think Debbie referred to it as a powder keg, which I found interesting because I've recently been characterizing it as a pressure cooker. Basically, you have this pressure cooker of trauma within the household and you have no outlets for the children, such as, in-person school or extracurriculars. To show you some tangible examples of what I've experienced in my personal practice, one example recently in the past few months has been stalking. If you could just go to the next slide. So one of my colleagues, the bulk of her practice is doing protective orders based upon stalking. She said she's noticed a large uptick in the stalking protective orders in the few months after the lockdowns were implemented, simply because there's these mental health issues that are exacerbated. You now have known schedules. So you know where that person's going to be. You know that they're most likely going to be at home working from home unless they happen to be out on an errand. And there's these, typical classic behaviors we think of as driving past the home, but also you have, calling someone's cell phone incessantly or text messaging them. And also Debbie touched on, but you have these substance abuse issues that people have been relying on substances during the pandemic to sort of self-soothe, and that's only making the issues worse. For those of you that may not know, stalking protective orders are sometimes more difficult to prevail upon. We often think of domestic violence as physical abuse, but we don't always think of the incessant phone calls or text messages as, domestic violence. So courts are generally slow to recognize that as domestic violence, but they're coming around. Next slide. So the next slide here is another, I wanted to highlight some things that we don't often think of. It deals with separated parties and the conflicts they're experiencing right now. So generally when parties are divorced, we might think that the abused has escaped the damaging environment, but that's not necessarily the case. So right now we have conflicts between parents on their pandemic approach. So social distancing, are they honoring that at mom's house? Is dad taking them on a trip? We have hygiene practices as simple as, like wearing a mask. One parent, promotes that, the other doesn't. We even have disparity between the parents on virtual versus in-person schooling. So where I practice up in Northern Virginia, some jurisdictions and public school systems, they have hybrid. And so, you can opt in to do virtual, you can opt in to do in person. And we've had parents that cannot agree on a set one, and that's caused some conflict that it's tough because the courts don't know really how to deal with that because it's such a novel issue. And so a lot of the conflict too is because the parties, their separation agreements, what they've had as part of their separation or divorce, the separation agreements don't necessarily contemplate what happens, for example, who gets the kids in a global pandemic. So sure, you have the separation agreement that might say mom gets the children on school holidays, but now with virtual school, every day is a school holiday. So that's some of the conflicts I've been seeing in my personal practice. And there's so many things we as attorneys on the courts didn't contemplate, before COVID-19. You also have financial issues. So that's something too Debbie touched on that I think is exacerbating a lot of the conflicts and what we've seen. It's difficult to pay child support or spousal support when you're no longer earning X amount because you lost your job. And you can't necessarily stop paying. You first have to go to court and ask the judge, can you stop paying or decrease the amount? And that's not an emergency. So you're going to be slow to be heard on the docket. And believe it or not, too, I've also had the issue where, one party test positive for COVID. They've been with the children. So now the children can't necessarily go back to the other parent's house. You need to follow the CDC guidelines. So now we have a parent that hasn't necessarily forfeited his or her custodial time, but they lost it. And, that's upsetting in any event. Going to the financial issues too, domestic violence not only is physical abuse or stalking, but it can be control over the finances. And that still happens after parties separate or divorce. You've had these parties recently who filed joint taxes and now they're getting their stimulus check. The stimulus check was deposited into one party's account, but now the other party doesn't have access to it. Typically, you could go to court and ask the judge to remedy the problem, but now you're not going to be heard immediately because it's a civil issue, so it's going to take less priority on the docket. Here in Fairfax, we have WebEx, which I think Virginia Beach is doing too. So there are ways around it, but it's not, the relief you're seeking from the court isn't as easy as it was prior to COVID-19 and the lockdowns. And that actually brings me to my next slide. Okay, so we have this backlog of cases, and I know in Fairfax, we're triaging the cases with criminal cases. They take priority due to a defendant's right to a speedy trial. There's docket priority for protective orders, and certainly any situations dealing with children protection cases, those take priority, as well as emergencies take greater priority. As I said before, civil matters such as divorce may take longer, and any issues as far as domestic violence within a divorce. So if part of your divorce is based on grounds of cruelty, that's going to take longer for the court to hear. Certainly, most times with these civil matters, you can just go into court and be heard. Now you're having, again, the pressure cooker. There's no relief from the court, and sometimes parties are trying to mitigate it themselves. It's not always the best idea. And, these perceived snafus between the parents, they might go unchecked, but we need to think about, children pick up on conflict between the parties. They're very aware of what's going on with mom and dad. And now these issues, for example, the stimulus check, the fight over that might not necessarily rise to the level of domestic violence, but there's going to be conflict between the parents, and that's going to raise the stress and anxiety of children when they're picking up on that. And I think that's something now that we can try to mitigate. As Debbie said, look out for your neighbors. Like, we're all going through tough times. So if we can decrease the stress and anxiety that the children are experiencing, that's going to help us when we finally get out of the pandemic. Because right now they're front loaded with isolation, no activities, the stress of homeschooling, and now to have mom and dad fighting, they're going to have anxiety, frankly, that might have ripple effects throughout the rest of their life and well after the pandemic is over. So that's all I have. I thank you all for having me, and I can turn it over now.
Thank you, Jenny. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Neisha Hymes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. I apologize if I'm kind of looking to the left. It's where the camera's placed, but hello. So we've heard some really great information. As Jenny mentioned earlier, there's a lot of overlap in what Ms. Debbie and Jenny have shared, just because, again, this is such an issue that we could talk about all day, and you'll learn something new from each speaker. So just for the purposes of this meeting and then our time, I'll just share from a small grassroots nonprofit organization. I was asked to tell a little bit about what we do, who we are, and then how COVID has affected what we do in the community as far as assisting families impacted by domestic violence. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So very briefly about myself, I am the founder of GROW Foundation, GROW standing for Girls Recognizing Our Worth. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization registered here in Virginia, as well as my native state of New Jersey. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, very passionate about the cause. And when I decided to start speaking out about my own experience, I found that a lot of people were going through it, as when you're in that situation, you think that you're alone. And my abuser, I have children, but my abuser is someone I did not have children with. So I was already had my children when I was in a relationship with this person. And it wasn't until years later where I learned that my children still saw the effects of that relationship, even though I never had them around my abuser. So it just goes to show that as someone who's was in an abusive relationship and didn't have her children around the offender, imagine the children who experience it every day, witnessing it every single day of their life. So where GROW came into place is where I tried to leave my job in the real estate field and was told constantly that I did not have the right experience to advocate against domestic violence. So for me, it was just like, okay, well, I survived it and I'm passionate about it and I want to help the women and the children and the men going through it. So I was rebellious and started my own organization and figured, who will tell me I don't have the right experience to run my own nonprofit? So that's where GROW came into play. From there, I became employed with the Norfolk Commonwealth Attorney's Office as a domestic violence victim advocate and got to see the other side of the fence. I got to learn the court system attending court 4 to 5 days out of the week and seeing oftentimes the same families in court, the same women, the same men, the same children in court. And it was just a heartbreaking reality that all of those cases, all of those orange files I used to see had a name and a family attached to it. I eventually left there and was with the Chesapeake Commonwealth Attorney's Office in their domestic violence unit, and now employed with the Newport News Police Department in their Special Victims Unit as the domestic violence outreach liaison for their new domestic violence program. So that's me in a nutshell. And if you could switch to the next slide, please. My team consists of 7 board members, and at this time about 4 volunteers. We all work full-time jobs, and is still doing full-time work. We run this organization. So as you can see, whether it's sitting on my lunch break here at work and doing much needed Zoom calls like this, getting off of work and assisting the families that we come across throughout the day, or on the weekends, bringing community awareness, whatever we can do to impact those families who need that help getting out of domestic violence situations, that's what we'll do. Our mission is to connect families, victims, and survivors with the resources needed to rebuild their lives after abuse. And our mission and our vision is to end domestic violence by collaboration, awareness, and educating our communities. With being a small grassroots nonprofit organization, we don't have I would say a lot of the resources that the larger agencies like your YWCAs, your Samaritan houses have, but because we have that boots to the ground, we are still just as impactful, and we have built these relationships with those agencies in the community to be able to provide the wraparound support for these families in need. So if you could flip to the next slide. So for the purposes of this call, I'll just really focus on the survivor advocacy and the resource referrals and the community outreach. So I would say an average of 25 families per year right now. And again, that's as a small grassroots nonprofit. And we look at that as, wow, we're growing. Our first year, we'll be 5 years old in August. And our first year, we may have assisted 5 families. So now it's 25 plus families. We've worked with CASA, we've worked with Child Protective Services, we've worked with other large agencies like Transitions, YWCA, Her Shelter. So we're what we like to consider ourselves as, it's that we don't have as much, I don't want to say red tape, because I feel like that's like a negative connotation, but it's, if a family is in need and they reach out to us, we may be able to provide that immediate support while we are trying to connect them with the resources that can assist with longer terms. I remember a family, very large family, mom had, I'll just say, over 6 children. And there was, it was a very volatile situation that she was in. And we worked hand in hand with CPS just because they were homeless, and staying in a hotel, and able to connect them with the resources as far as counseling for the children, counseling for mom. She needed to be connected with CASA workers for court, so able to assist in that frame as well. Where COVID has played a role is it's affecting everything. We have a family who mom used her emergency funds. As Jenni said, financial abuse is very real. Prevalent 99% of domestic violence cases. Mom had emergency funds under the bathroom sink in a tampon box, and offender found them and found the money and took all of her emergency funds to be able to leave. So we were able to help with financial assistance with getting her to a place where she could do a security deposit, a first month's rent for another place. So we try to do what we can with what we have, and what we aren't able to do directly, we connect them with the resources who can. We had another situation where, okay, we have children at home. They're doing virtual learning. And as Jenni said, you have parents, some want to do virtual, some want to do in school. And this was a particular argument between this family that we were assisting. And whenever the child would engage with their teacher virtually, the parent the abuser who did not agree with virtual learning would cause a scene, to the point where the child's learning was interrupted. And not only was their learning interrupted, they were embarrassed. You know, it alerted the teacher to, okay, something is going on here, but now it's putting the mother in a situation where abuse is, you want to keep it in the dark usually. You don't want anyone to know what's going on in the household. We're operating under that. What happens in the home stays in the home. And we know that the most dangerous time is for a victim is when they're trying to leave. So if people find out what's going on behind those closed doors, then it makes it a little bit harder for the victim to be discreet. So, and trying to provide resources when the offender is in the home with them. So whereas we would be able to FaceTime, we would be able to Zoom, we would be able to call, now we're having to find more creative ways to be able to contact that victim. There's one in particular, I can only text during certain times, but it's hard because those certain times are while I'm at work or my team is at work. So we just have to find different ways to meet the need of the victims and survivors and their families that we work to assist. Community outreach is big. Events, webinars such as this, major, because we have to bring awareness to where awareness isn't. A lot of people have this thought that domestic violence is just physical abuse. It's just a male offender and a female victim, and that's not the case. It's affecting people of all different ages, educational backgrounds, financial backgrounds, different neighborhoods, communities. It affects us all, and it doesn't just stay within the confines of that home. It affects the house, the workplace. It affects children in school. You may find children who are growing up in homes where there is abuse, where they're doing poorly in school. Maybe they're having more medical issues such as headaches, stomach aches. Maybe they're being neglected. You're seeing them on virtual calls and they're dirty, or they haven't eaten, or there's food insecure. Just so many different ways that this pandemic, if you will, this epidemic that we are really trying to get rid of, it just impacts everyone. So I don't know if that's my time. I feel like I'm out of breath, but it's just real. And as far as what you can do to help spread the word, talk about domestic violence, talk about child abuse. This is Child Abuse Prevention Awareness Month. We all can do something. So whether you're joining in on calls such as this, whether you're contacting your local agency and saying, what can I do to help? That's our call to action to you. Donations, 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 whether it's to GROW, to CASA, or wherever you're affiliated with, you can call your local agency and say, what do you guys need? Sometimes it's a matter of providing new children's medicine, socks, toiletries. With COVID, I know a lot of the agencies in the community are accepting new items only. So I would definitely check with them to see what is needed. When families leave with nothing, they literally have nothing. It could be something as small as, I remember a mother didn't have a can opener, you know, and we don't think about that. We think about, okay, let's get some toothpaste and toothbrushes and things like that. But when you need to open a can of soup for your children to eat for dinner and you don't have a car to get to the store, and you realize you don't have a can opener and you don't have a knife to kind of trying to cut around the rim, then what do? So just please reach out to your local agencies, monetary donations, gift cards, Uber, Lyft, so that they can get to doctor's appointments, job interviews, court. Those go a long way, and let's partner. GROW is always looking to collaborate on awareness and outreach events. I know COVID has tried to slow some of that down, but as you can see, by all of the amazing people on this call, we are not letting that stop us. So please contact your local agency to find out how you can partner to bring awareness to this very important issue. And that's it.
Thank you so very much, Debbie, Jenni, Neisha. Thank you. So now we will have a little bit of time for questions. I'll start off with a few questions that were pre-submitted at the time of registration, and then we will move on to anything in the chat box as time permits. So the first question is for any or all of the panelists. What actions can the average citizen take in preventing and addressing child abuse in the community?
So I would say anything and everything. So being connected to other people and supporting other people in their walk through life. So many of the families that we are working with are under enormous stress, and it's not just pandemic related. It is economic. It is, all other sorts of issues. And so just making sure that you're reaching out and providing support to those in your inner circle. You might also want to reach out to your faith-based communities as well to reach out. For CASA, we're preventing child abuse by preventing it happening again. And that's a huge piece. We're stopping that cycle for these families. And so that's huge from our perspective. So if you have the time to be able to volunteer to an organization such as CASA or GROW or another organization nonprofit wise, we encourage you to do that. There's tons of agencies that need support.
Jenni or Neisha, would either one of you like to chime in before I move on to the next question?
I would just echo what Debbie said. I think the biggest thing is to be the eyes and the ears in the community. So the more eyes and ears we have to see what's going on sort of behind closed doors, I think that's important. And generally, being in community, you're going to have the support system and hopefully be able to mitigate some of those stressors just to rely on your neighbor. So I would recommend that.
And
Can I also, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Ms. Debbie, go ahead.
I was just going to add in that anybody can call in to Child Protective Services hotline and make a report if you suspect abuse or neglect in your community, in your neighbor's home. You see a kid walking down the street in a diaper and they're, a year and a half old. Anybody can call that number in your locality and make an anonymous referral to Child Protective Services. They cannot reveal your information and who you are. Sorry about that, Neisha.
Oh, no, you're fine. You actually just said, just to piggyback on what you were going to say, I was going to say to lean on your community. If you see something, say something. We have to get out of the mindset that it's none of my business. It's not about trying to break up a home or anything like that, but keep that child safe. So as Ms. Debbie said, you can call Child Protective Services, you can call your local domestic violence hotline if you're not sure, and just mention, these are the things I'm witnessing, not really sure if this would fall under something that should be paid attention to. And you can get insight from trained advocates and service workers who will be able to, lead you down that just to let you know if what you're thinking is valid and what they can do next to be able to assist.
Thank you. For the next question, this is for Debbie. How can CASAs and other support people lean in right now when home visits are still limited? What should we be listening for? And this is coming from a Richmond CASA volunteer.
Yay, Richmond CASA is represented. Hi, how are you, Angela? It's good to see you. Thank you for messaging me directly too. So as CASAs, the virtual thing is so frustrating, but it's a good protective mechanism during this time. So what we do on our virtual visits is we ask to tour the home. So we have them take their cell phone camera around, and oftentimes it's the kiddos because we love to have them show us their rooms and show us where they live, maybe even take us outside and let us see Fido, right? So whatever they're doing, we want to see where they're living. That's what we would normally do when we go into a home visit if it was in person. We also talk to the family members by phone. So if we need to have a more private conversation, we can do it that way. A kiddo can take a phone into maybe, a rec room or something like that and have a little bit more private conversation. But we're also talking with everybody else in that child's life. And so by doing that, you're getting multiple experiences about the same child, multiple perspectives. And sometimes you may hear inconsistencies. And when we hear those, we ask deeper questions, right? To try to get to the bottom of it. We're not investigating abuse or neglect itself, but if we hear a child say something and then a parent say something totally different about the same scenario, it raises a red flag for us. So we just want to ask more questions. We want to let them know that we're available at any time. This is not a 9 to 5 for CASA or other serving organizations, right? We have passion for this. So call us, let us know when there's an issue, and just keep your eyes and ears open. That's what we do. Great question. Thank you.
Thanks. The next question is for everyone. How do you differentiate between emotional and verbal abuse toward the toddler and natural child growth behavior? What behavioral signs are indicative of emotional, verbal, or physical abuse?
Oh.
I would say in my personal practice, what I've observed and heard from the children psychologists that get involved in some of these cases is a lot of times perhaps coaching. So you can see when a parent has coached a child, and I think Debbie just touched on that too. Like if there's a disparity in what's coming out of the child's mouth and what's coming out of mom or dad's mouth, it's typically something that would raise a flag. Also, if the child is speaking with more sophistication than what you would expect out of a 3 or 4-year-old, or know things that are of much more mature nature than what they should be watching on TV, for example, there's something there as far as the coaching, which is dovetails into parental alienation, where one parent is trying to withhold the child from the other parent, and those issues tend to go on even into the child's adulthood. The child will wrestle with the fact that there was some perhaps perceived parental alienation going on in their adolescence, that perhaps, or younger than that as well, that perhaps drove a wedge to that between that parent that they could have had a strong relationship with.
Erica, I saw your comment in there that this child is nonverbal. So we're always watching everything when we're in virtual visits or when we're meeting with folks. And so we're watching how that child responds to a parent just while we're there, right? And how that child is that child sort of cowering when a parent is talking with them? Is that child making eye contact, and are they smiling at each other? We're looking for those sorts of things. We're not deciding if it's abuse or neglect, but we're seeing red flags like Jenni mentioned. And those are the things that we would report to the appropriate authorities to look into further.
Agreed. And sorry, I see that the child was nonverbal. Something as simple as playing with the child and a parent, you can pick up on a lot of what's going on and how they relate with that parent. Like if the parent sits down on the floor and is playing with the child, and the child kind of recoils, turns away, you might think like, this might be a show. Maybe dad or mom doesn't often do that with the child, and this is new that, mom or dad is sitting on the floor and playing with the child.
Okay. For the next question, this is for Debbie. Due to the lack of exposure, what is the status of mandated reporters and student runaways?
So mandated reporters, the status stays the same, pandemic, no pandemic. If we suspect abuse or neglect, we have to report it. We are seeing a large number of children, or larger number of children running away. And so that speaks back to the powder keg or pressure cooker that Jenni and I were talking about, as far as, there's so many stressors on our kiddos, and particularly with school related issues, just because of the virtual versus in-person thing going on. So we report anything that we see as abuse or neglect, or that may have led to that child running away. That's always our role as mandated reporters. I hope that answers your question.
So that concludes the pre-submitted questions. Melvina, were there any in the chat box?
There were, and Neisha actually responded to the ones in the chat, but I thought they were fantastic questions and her responses were really great. So I would like to speak, to actually state those questions for the people that might be on their phone and can't see the chat box. So how does GROW find the people it helps? And then with all that you do, how do you process all the horrors that you hear about?
Oftentimes with GROW, people will refer. The main thing is people will fill out our intake application on our website, which I've listed in the chat. It's www.growfoundationva.org. There's an intake application under the Contact GROW tab, and it asks a series of questions that the survivor completes, and then an advocate from our team we'll give that survivor a call and then go through the remaining intake process from there. We also receive a lot of referrals in the community. A lot of times it's happening via social media, where someone will send us an inbox and just say, listen, this family is in need, this young lady or this young man, and we provide our contact information so that that survivor is empowered with the decision to contact us. I don't want to call at the wrong time or when it's not safe to call. I don't want our number to show up on their caller ID. So we let that person know to please pass our email address or our phone number so that that survivor can contact us. And as far as the second question, how do I assume that's for everyone, but for me personally, how I deal with what I see on a constant basis, it's tough. It got a bit harder once I joined, once I started working in this field 9 to 5, but particularly working here in the Special Victims Unit with the police department, because I'm now more exposed to children who have been impacted not just by abuse, but by sexual assault. So not just physical abuse or verbal, but sexual assault. And it's hard sometimes to separate it, because now you kind of look at the world differently. I'm a mom and I can't imagine these things happening to children. Right before this call, I was coloring with a little boy, and just to be sitting there coloring with him, but knowing why he was here in the office is just heartbreaking. So for me, just self-care. I do boxing. That's very therapeutic. I love spending time with my family, and I love, anyone will tell you, love eating cookies. So if you see me boxing, eating cookies, or at home, I'm good. So that's it for me.
For me, it's self-care as well, maintaining my boundaries, knowing when I need to shut it off and spend time with family and friends. But it's also these children that I see on a daily basis. These are not just statistics. This is not just a name on a piece of paper. These are very real children to me that I get to interact with and laugh with and have a good time with. And they're not just the abuse. They are full families who may live next door to you. And so just remembering that and knowing that I am making a difference in their lives, one child at a time, makes all the difference for me. And I'm impacting directly a family in my work. So I encourage everybody to do that in whatever way they feel comfortable.
Follow up, yes, self-care. I think spending time with family and friends, I think that's been a little bit more difficult with the pandemic. So exercising, working out, getting outside, it's been what I've been trying to do.
Fantastic. So this is kind of a joint question from Katie. Are there ways that we could have been better prepared? And have there been changes to the way that you work due to the pandemic that you see continuing once things open up again?
I don't know if we could have been better prepared. I will say there are certain things in my practice that have improved since the pandemic. I think there's conversations in the bar that, now that we can have some motions and hearings virtually, like how do we reconcile charging a client to drive all the way to court and sit for 3 hours waiting for the motion to be heard? It's really nice. You can just sit in the office, open up your laptop, and be in front of a judge at a designated time. And it certainly helps my clients, wallets, because a lot of these clients don't have that much money. And it's nice that we're cutting out, 3 hours of billable time. I actually think that's a good thing that's come out of this. The courts have sort of had to quickly get up to speed on technology. And if anything, I think that's the best thing that's happened.
I echo her sentiments exactly. So many of our parents have to take off of work to come to court, sit for hours, as Jenny said. Not only are they expected to do that, but they're expected to take off of work to complete services that they've been ordered to do, oftentimes several times a week for hours at a time. So any lessening of time that they're spending in court and transportation costs and all that is very helpful. So I'm proud of the court in making those changes.
And to answer on my end, I echo Jenny. I don't know if there are ways to have been better prepared. I don't think any of us really expected this. And then when it just comes to abuse as a whole, child abuse is just shocking for a lot of us, you know, just to imagine that someone would harm a child. As far as ways that there have been changes that we work now, we definitely rely more heavily on technology. There are things that I think that we would continue to do because it's forced us to take more precaution as it relates to speaking with victims and survivors. So now I'm able to lean more on my volunteers, you know, whereas a lot of it fell on me as far as responding to the victims and survivors. But we have a better system in place to offer more immediate support. So that is just definitely something I think that we would continue going forward.
All right, well, we do have 2 additional minutes. So I do see that Erica Wilson has a question, but it might be more of a very in-depth question. So I definitely want to connect her with Debbie after the call, because I think that's definitely a question that you can answer for her. But at this moment, I just want to thank you ladies for the grace and the dignity that you brought to this panel today. It's a very sensitive topic. I know that I am definitely going to be walking a little bit differently and trying to, you know, stay in tune and pay attention to different things that might come up in my life that might be affecting children or women that are desperately in need of our support, like you said, to watch our neighbors and everything. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And please have a very great rest of your day.
Thank you all so much.